Welcome back to the Razor Crest series, and now we need to start compositing what we rendered in the last video. So for this, you definitely need to have something rendered from Maya, and as we progress through this, you probably made some mistakes. I certainly found some issues that I needed to correct, and we'll go back into Maya and then just make sure all of those are fixed for the next version that we render. All right, let's get started. All right, so for this next part, I'm assuming that you have rendered out all 200 frames of each render layer. That's what we need in order to begin compositing this and see if there's anything that we need to change in Maya when we go back to render our final version. So just to clarify, you need at least 2 different iterations of this while you're working through it. You need like a rough draft and then the final thing. That said, you might need to have more renders as you work through this if you realize certain things aren't working. But the bare minimum would be 2, one that's pretty low quality and one that will take longer to render but will be nicer quality. So even with the denoising on here, there will be some issues with that, with the settings that we used last time. So the first thing we have to do is load in the full frames. And there's 2 different ways to do this. I'll show you both ways. If your render layers over here say a range, so in this case, I rendered out frame 200 in the last lecture just to make sure everything was, being composited properly. This says 200 to 200. If yours has some kind of range in there, all you have to do is select the layers, right click and do reload. And then you'll see the full sequence gets loaded in here and everything is good. Now, if this does not happen to you and you see like a little Photoshop icon or the icon of the software that is associated with the EXR format on your computer, right click on any one of these. You have to do each one in turn. So I'll start with the dust, replace footage with file. So in this case, we're doing dust. We'll go to the dust folder. And you can simply click on any one of these frames in the sequence. So it doesn't have to be the first one, but just make sure that the Open EXR sequence option is checked. So if this was off for you, After Effects will interpret these as just individual images, but if this is checked, it will look to see if it thinks it's part of a sequence. So you want to make sure that that is set, then you can click Import, and then it would import. Then you would do the next one for Environment, Ship, and then Sky all separately. When they have all loaded in, just make sure that these are going all the way to frame 200. Or actually in After Effects, this will be 199 because After Effects starts on 0 and Maya by default starts at 1. For clarity, we should have changed that, but it doesn't really matter. Just remember that there's a 1 frame offset. Just make sure all the layers are there. For whatever reason, my dust layer here did not go all the way. So just make sure that that is there. One other thing I want to do just before we continue is make sure that everything matches what we had in Maya on our master scene. So I'm going to Maya, I'm going to select the master scene, go to render settings. I'm going to disable the animation. And then on frame 200 down here, I'm going to just render out 1 frame and just check to make sure that this matches up with what we had composited last time. Now, this is something that we kind of did last time, but we didn't actually take in the master layer. So it would be a good idea just to double check, just to see if there's any minor issue that is wrong. In the previous lecture, we should have been able to catch any major problem. Master layer, load in the master layer, and I'll just drag this underneath the OCIO, save there. So there's going to be a few things that are different with the master. The first thing is, and this is a pretty big deal that I need to talk about, and we kind of talked about this last time, but the ground here blocks where the landing gear shows up in the master layer, but in our version, we didn't actually include the ground in the ship render layer, so we have to do that in a different way. There's a couple different things that we can do on that. But if we turn the master layer back on, we can see that, first of all, there's no denoising, so it's very grainy. If we can see here in the hull on the front of the ship, it's pretty grainy. And if we toggle this on and off, you can see that the denoising is very smooth, almost a little bit too smooth, and it does kind of average out those colors. So we are losing a little bit of the lightness there. And then you'll also see that the glare has been applied to our passes, but it doesn't get applied to our beauty or our master layer here. So that is also going to be another difference. But for the most part, if you turn this on and off and you see like wildly different values, or you see your dust is there and then it's not there in the other one, then that would be a problem. For us, our dust kind of finishes at frame 200. So it's something I do want to change. There is a little bit of dust in there. So if I turn this off and then toggle the dust on and off, you can see there's a little bit of dust left, something I want to go back and change a little bit later. Now we need to talk about the landing gear. And this is something that we probably should have done a more complicated matte in Maya to prevent this issue from happening. But depending on how you did it, we could easily solve this with Cryptomatte. So in the previous lecture, I showed you this environment ground matte. So if we turn this on and solo this, basically I thought that, hey, we can use Cryptomatte to select this piece of geometry. And since the ship would be behind this, everything is good. Although I actually made a mistake when I was doing this. So if I select my ground matte, click T for opacity and just kind of lower the opacity, After Effects is going to use this outline here to determine where the gear should show up and where it should not show up. And this matte is actually higher to where the rocks are. So let me show you what happens if we try to use this as a matte. But this might actually be a really good solution for you, depending on how the ship lands and how tilted your camera is and how tall the displacement is on your ground. If the camera is looking down, this probably wouldn't even be a problem. But if you were following along with me and did a very similar camera action, this might be an issue. Okay, so what we're going to do, we need to have a matte for each one of these layers. So this is something that we've done before in After Effects. It's no big deal. But this time we want the same matte to be applied to all of these different passes. So I'm going to show you a foolproof but kind of cumbersome way to do it first. And then we'll go with a newer way, which can work a lot of the time, but for certain things, it's not going to be a good solution. But I want to show you both things just to show you that there are multiple ways of doing this, more or less the same thing in After Effects. Because we want multiple copies of this environment ground matte, but we want them to be instanced. So anytime we make a change to one of them, they all get updated. What we're going to do is pre-compose it, because pre-comps in After Effects are instanced. So a change to one pre-comp is always going to change the other one. So we'll do Control-Shift-C. I'm just going to take off the one there to say comp. I'm going to move all attributes into the layer, which will take the Cryptomatte and put it on top of this layer here. We click OK, and then you can see the Cryptomatte's gone because Cryptomatte is now on here. And we're going to copy this layer and then go all the way to the ship GI layer and then just click Control V. So this will paste it on top of it. And remember that mattes must go above the layer that needs the matte. And then we'll go to the next one, just paste, 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 and paste. We're not going to worry about ship depth right now. We'll do that in a different way. And then you can go through each one of these passes, just Control select them. And then for the track matte, because this ground plane is white, and we actually don't want it to show up where it's white, we would say on our track matte, Luma inverted. And as soon as we do that, we can see that, hey, the gear is now behind the rocks and everything is good, except for the fact that our screen right landing gear, it thinks that is actually behind the base of the cliff here, which is not correct. If you had a lot of dust here, it probably wouldn't be a problem. And if you had your rocks that were much higher, it also wouldn't be a problem. It would be fine. So this might be a good solution for you. But for me, I need to fix that back in Maya. So that's one way of doing this. I'm actually going to Control Z that and then Control Z a few times to get rid of all of those environment mattes. I want to show you how you can use this layer on all of these different passes without having to make pre-comp and without having to have duplicates. So I'm going to Control Z all of that so it's just as it was before we did anything at all. And we're going to start on the ship GI layer. I'm going to solo this and then turn on the transparency toggle so we can see the whole ship because it's pretty much black. And then on a black background, you can barely see it. So we want to make sure we have some kind of contrast. Next, we're going to grab a set matte effect. And the set matte effect allows a layer to use a matte, but not as a track matte, just as referencing another layer. So a track matte has to go directly above that layer. Set matte effect can go anywhere inside that comp. We'll drag on the set matte effect, and then it says take matte from layer, and then here we select the environment ground matte. Where it says source, we change that to effects and masks in case we have any type of adjustment on the mask, like an effect or something. We would want it to honor that. And then by default, it will use the alpha channel, but the alpha channel is completely solid. So we want to say luminance. And as soon as we click luminance, it's going to say that the ship can show up only where the ground plane is white. So we want to invert that. And now it doesn't show up where it's white. So just to show you where that is, right here. So this is referencing this, and wherever this is, it's going to be off. Okay, now we can grab that effect and paste that on each one of these passes. Again, we're not going to do the ship depth for right now. Unsolo this, and then you say, hey, we got the same thing that we had before. So it's a little bit of a cleaner solution because you don't bloat your scene with a whole heap of basically the same matte. Another option that you might try to use is pre-composing all of these, but I don't recommend that because, first of all, it makes it cumbersome to make adjustments to any of these layers if you have a pre-comp, and there are certain things you cannot do. So I like to have all the passes out here, which would require multiple copies of the ground matte, or use the set matte effect. Now, when you're using the set matte effect must go underneath extractor. Extractor must be the first thing, then set matte effect. And if you had a curves adjustment or anything like we played around last time with doing a curves on the reflection pass, make sure the set matte effect would go above that. But any of these layers that you had that, it needs to go above curves. Otherwise, you can run into some weird issues later. And you also can't do this, right? You need to make sure that set matte effect is underneath extractor. I'm actually not going to be using the set matte effect, and I'm going to be doing my matte in Maya. So I realized I made a mistake in that. I really should have made a more complicated ship layer, but I was trying to get away with doing it just with a Cryptomatte. But unfortunately, for me, I need to take into account the fact that the ground is actually higher than this, and we need just these set of rocks. So if your camera is looking down and you can see all the landing gear, it might not be an issue. But if any of the rocks poke up above the landing gear or completely occlude it, like in this one, you would need to have some kind of matte either in After Effects or in Maya. And in my case, I do need to use Maya. If you can see some of the landing gear is in front of the rocks and some of it is behind, you would also need to do it in Maya. So I'll show you that a little bit later. And since we have to re-render anyway, it's not really a big deal, but it's something that we do need to fix because you can't turn in something like this. I would take off points for incorrect mattes because the shadows don't even line up. Okay, so that is important that they do. All right, so that's something that I wanted to show you is going to be a problem, but we're going to fix it a little bit later. And I'm going to leave this in this state right now. But now we need to move on to just prepping our comp and making sure everything else is good to go. Start playing around with the composite, and then we'll go back into Maya. So there are a few things that we need to double check and just make sure everything is set properly. Otherwise, if you don't fix this, you will end up ruining your composite and having to start over, or you'd be submitting something that is not going to be visually correct. And if I notice it, which I probably will, you'll lose points for it. So just make sure that you set this up properly. First thing is, you need to make sure that this down here says 32 BPC. So recall the lecture on color bit depth. 32 bits per channel gives us a massive amount of color space to work in. It's the highest that's available to us, and it's the highest that EXR support. We rendered out 16-bit EXRs, so you technically could be on this, but we're going to be using effects that are going to take advantage of 32 bits, so we really need to be on this one. By default, After Effects says 8. 8 is not even high enough to be able to show you what the EXR looks like from Maya. It's not going to be able to show the correct color information. So we have to be on at least 16, but in our case, we really need to be on 32 bits per channel. Second one is the working space. Now, when I click this goes way off screen on the second monitor, but you need to make sure to scroll to the top and make sure this says sRGB. And then the last thing is you must linearize. If you don't linearize, the entire thing will be incorrect. So all three of these settings are critical before we begin compositing. So this is something to double check. The next thing is you want to make sure that every layer is underneath this OCIO layer. But basically just an adjustment layer that we created, adjustment layer 1. Quick tip here, if you want to see what you originally called something or what the original layer is called, like this is the ship, you just click up here where it says layer name or source name and it'll flick back between both. So we're looking at the source name right now. We select it, we look at the layer name or whatever we called it when we renamed the layer. So on this adjustment layer, you need to have the Open Color IO plugin. Our configuration should be set to display. Input space is ACES CG, display is sRGB, and the view is ACES 1 SDR video. This is the same thing that we use in Maya, and this is the only way to get the renders to look the same as they did in Maya or V-Ray or whatever, the frame buffer that we used in Maya. After that, you must have a color profile converter. This is what linearizes the conversion done in OpenColor IO, because After Effects also corrects the entire plate, that makes it look really washed out. So if you look at something like this, it's completely wrong. You need to make sure you have both the input and output profiles set to sRGB, but the output profile is linearized, okay? If you have questions or concerns about what that actually means, and you want a more in-depth explanation than what we've talked about, let me know, and I'd be more than happy to give you more information about it. The very last thing that we need to do is fix our aspect ratio. So while we will be turning in a full HD 1920 by 1080 render, because that's the format that our slate is in, we'll just render that with letterboxing, which is fine. While we're working on the main comp here, we don't want to have all of this excess space, because this is going to make it a little bit awkward to do certain things like camera blur. And if we have any extra effects that we put on, they might seep out into this black space, which we don't want. So we're going to turn off the toggle transparency grid so you can see these letterboxes. We don't really want to see those in this comp. So you can either right click over your comp, go to comp settings, you can go to composition settings, or you can just do Control K. When we click that for the height, we want to make sure that this is unlocked. And then for the height, just say 817. Going to put it in the correct aspect ratio. If you used a different aspect ratio that was not 2.35, if you, let's say, did 2.39, which is another common one, or there's a few of them that you can use, you would just need to look at the resolution that you've rendered in Maya. So if I click OK, and then I select one of these layers up here, it will tell you what the resolution is. Basically, you just want to make sure that these two numbers are the same. Okay. The last thing is the duration. So we rendered out 200 frames from Maya. We'll just type in 200. When we do the final comp, we will add one more frame for the slate, but we're not going to do that just yet. Okay. All right. So that is what we have to do to get everything set up. We also need to save this. So let's go to File, Save As. We'll go to our projects folder, and I'm going to create a new folder called Comps. We'll say Comps, and then inside here, we'll just label this as, I'll just label this as NE270 Razor Crest version 1. You want to make sure the version number of your composition matches whatever you have in Maya. Okay, so anytime you up version something in Maya, you need to up version your After Effects. Let's say you did a whole bunch of stuff in After Effects and you're on version 10, the next file in Maya should be version 10, okay? Because you need to synchronize which ones are using which set of frames. Otherwise it gets out of sync and very hard to figure out which ones you were actually using. So let's just say NE270 Razor Crest version 1. You could also just put in the assignment number here if you wanted to. That would be fine as well. Okay, so there's a few things that we need to do, but the first thing that we really should do is just make sure that if we go to the very beginning here, we render the entire thing out and just make sure that everything is working as we expect, or find issues, and there's going to be issues no matter what you do. So we're going to change our resolution here to half. This is going to make it a little bit blurry, but it'll render faster. You can go up to the preview tab here and just click the start, or you can click spacebar. And what this is going to do, every frame is going to turn green, which is going to load in that frame into your system RAM. So instead of saving it to a hard drive, which is pretty slow to retrieve, it's going to save it on your memory, and it's going to be very, very fast to load. So once the entire shot loads, we can watch it in real time and then take a look at some of the issues. So as we go through this, there are going to be some issues with the dust, and there's going to be some timing issues, and you'll also notice, probably on yours too, that the dust is going to be pretty grainy. Like it's far too grainy for what we need, because I forgot to turn on denoising. So that's something that we need to do when we go back into Maya. We also have a really weird hotspot here, and I'm not sure what causes this, but we're going to go back into Maya later on and try to fix that. If that happens for you, just take note of whatever we come up with. But I think it looks like a reflection of the sun, but the dust shouldn't be reflecting the sun like that, but maybe it's a bug. I don't know, but I think we can get rid of it pretty easily. So here the dust is very, very thick, but as you'll see, the dust is going to fade away way too quickly, which is something else I want to correct. Because really, as the ship is like about to touch the ground, this should be kicking up a lot more dust. And of course, the fact that the landing gear sticks over the top of the rocks is a problem, but as I said, we will fix this in Maya. All right, so now we can see the whole thing, and there are some issues with it for sure, but I think overall, I'm pretty pleased with it. There's a weird part where the ship dips, and I mentioned this before, it kind of like nose dives. I think I would like to correct that. But for the most part, yeah, we could spend a lot more time with the animation, maybe we should, but this is primarily for the composite and how you're doing the lighting. So as long as you're using some principles of animation, there is a little bit of a bounce, and it's not just using linear keyframes everywhere, or it's not just going straight down with no life to it, I think it's okay. So if it's something like this, I'd be happy with that, okay? It'd be also really cool to have the landing gear extend out as it comes into land, but that requires, you to set up a basic rig, which I don't really want to spend time doing. So if you'd like to, that'd be really cool if it works well, and get a couple extra points for that. But primarily it's basically, can you follow along with the rest of the comp and make something that matches the quality of what we do in the lecture. All right, so first thing, I'm going to turn off my dust, and we'll just take a look at the ship as it is, because the dust is it's too grainy to really do any other composite right now. I guess you could leave it on if you're at the end. You could just go right to the end, you can leave it on, but I'm just going to turn it off. So one problem that I'm seeing is, while this might be correct, if I go to my info tab here, and I just hover over the ship, these values are clipping out at like 0. And technically, Asus CG's SDR video is a tone mapper, and it prevents clipping for the most part, but it doesn't necessarily prevent clamping. So these values over here are getting very, very dark. If I turn this off, you can see that there actually is quite a lot of value here, and that's good. So it's not really messing up anything there, because these values are already above 0. But with this on, it is making everything pretty dark, and I do want to fix that, because I'm not satisfied with how dark that is. The front side also looks very dark, and I think that we could kind of make this pop a little bit better. So let's go over to a frame where it's not quite landed, maybe something around here. I'm going to do Shift/ or the question mark key just to fit this up to 100%, or you can just click on this button here, and that just frames it perfectly in your viewport. Last time we played around with some curves adjustments, and I don't believe we did anything on the GI or lighting, because there's barely anything here. So we're not going to do anything on the GI or the lighting. So next we'll go to the reflection layer. Because the ship uses a PBR metal material, that is getting the most of the light. So if we select that layer, you can see there's a lot of color information here. So if we turn this on, we actually get quite a lot of information back. And just a clarification, PBR refers to getting a correct looking material to the point where you render it. But after you've rendered something that uses PBR or uses ACES or whatever, it's physically correct outside of Maya, for example, or outside of Max or outside of Blender, whatever it is. But when you go into After Effects to composite it, you're not really breaking the workflow, but you're just making adjustments. But it's important to make adjustments on materials that were already photorealistically correct in the way that they preserve light and color information. But the whole point of compositing is to have some artistic freedom. So let's say I wanted to boost the reflections like I'm doing here. That's fine to do, okay? So don't worry about that if you think that, hey, this is too reflective for the scene. Maybe it is in Maya. Maybe you are correct. And you probably are correct in Maya that this is incorrect, because maybe it is so dark and there's not enough light getting in here. There's light hitting this face and hitting the rocks behind the camera and then bouncing back at the ship. But we don't really have any reference what is behind us in this case. And I think that brightening up the main subject of the shot is a very important thing to do. So we wouldn't want to go overboard with it and like make this ridiculously reflective like that. That looks really fake, okay? We just want to add a little bit of subtlety to this, okay? So we could do something like this. But another thing that we could do is brighten up all of the layers together, because it is getting a little bit dark. So what I'd like to do, I'll go up to my ship depth layer, Control D to duplicate that, and I'll just call this ship matte. And I'd like to have an adjustment layer that affects only the ship layers beneath it, so all of them at once. So on the adjustment layer, I can call this ship CC for color correction. And on the ship matte, if I turn this layer on, solo it, right now it's on depth. But instead of using the depth channel, I could go to the red, green, and blue channels and just say A, and A. This is the alpha. So we're just saying red, green, and blue, they're all just going to be whatever the alpha channel is. And that just allows us a quick and easy outline of the ship. All right, so then we can turn off the ship matte. Then on the ship CC layer, if I grab a curves on here and just crank this up, you can see we're affecting everything. But what we want to do is say on the track matte, we want to use the alpha. You could also say luminance in this case because it is white, but alpha is probably safer because we just used the alpha before. So we say alpha and then hooray, cool. I also wanted to show you some weird artifacts that we can get. Even though the ACES is preventing clipping, these are black values. These are negative values. So if I turn this off, and then we hover over this area here, we can see that these go to like -30. So anytime you see a blue ring, and then inside that ring it gets darker and darker and darker and then ends up being black, that's an indication of negative light. It's still clipping. And the area around here, all this white area, is also clipped as well. Like this 1.5 value here, it's just getting so bright it is clipping. So ACES does prevent that, but basically it says, hey, it's just 0 now. It's not going to be any less than 0. It's just going to be 0. Okay. And then for the blue channel, it's giving it a little bit of blue, but this is still negative light and it's still bad. And the reason it's happening is because we have forced so much more light into the scene that there is no data there. There's nothing that it can do. So it kind of goes in the opposite direction and starts adding in negative light, which is bizarre. So let's not do that. Instead, I didn't actually want to use the curves there at all. I wanted to show you another effect that we could start using, which is the exposure. Now, exposure tends to work better if we're using the entire ship at once and not just individual layers, but we could also do it on the entire plate. This is the entire thing if we wanted to. But curves is great and you can do more or less the same types of things, but exposure works much more like a camera does. When exposure on a camera, you have like a little notch and then you can increase the notch, which increases your exposure steps. And we can do something like that. So right away, we could say for the exposure, a value of 1. And see how that just brightens up the entire ship right now. If I go back to my reflection layer and I turn off that curves, we can see what this is doing a little bit more clearly because there's no additional interactions. If I turn this layer off and on, it's pretty dark here. But turning this on, this gets it to a value that's much closer to what I want. And it's not just affecting the reflection, it's affecting all of those passes. So that even though the GI and lighting are not containing that much data, the data that is there is going to be a little bit brighter. Okay, another thing though is if we go back to our info tab and hover over this, we're still getting very, very dark values. So much like with the curves that we could just lift the black values. So let me show you what I mean. Grab a curves effect, pull this over. Lifting the black values is doing this. That's just going to make that a little bit brighter, or in this case, a lot brighter. This is called lifting the blacks. But I don't want to use curves. In exposure, this is called offset. So here I could do offset 0.1, and it's going to be a lot, right? So instead, we're going to do something like 0.025. And now if we turn this on and off, you can see there's quite a bit more light that's been added here, but it doesn't look ridiculous. It doesn't look like we completely blown this out of proportion. We could lower that maybe a little bit more, but for now, I think I'm going to leave that. We don't want our black values to get super, super dark, and we don't want our white values to get super, super bright. So if a shadow is way too dark, just lift it up or offset it very slightly. And this is going to allow us a little bit more just information here. We never want that to be pitch black. All right, so moving down here, before we put the ship glare right above specular, and then we had the refraction stuff, it doesn't necessarily matter, but in this case, I do want to place this above AO because AO is going to make it a little bit darker. So AO, we could put AO wherever you want. So it doesn't have to go above your reflections. You could put AO directly above your lighting or GI. And let's see what happens if we put it directly above GI. You can see everything else gets a little bit brighter now that the reflections are allowed to get a little bit brighter. But because this is not part of the beauty and you are compositing it, you can basically put this wherever it looks visually the most accurate and pleasing. If I put this directly above GI, maybe that makes the most sense for you. That's fine. But if you want it to kind of darken down some of your reflections too, put this on the top of all the other lighting layers, except the glare, because the glare is going to be a post effect, and the glare is really on the camera lens. And anything that's on the camera lens should be on top of scene layers, like the ship itself. You can see how that is glowing on top of all of this. This also might be a little bit large. I know last time I said, hey, I want it to be pretty large, but we may have made that a little bit big. But I think for now it's okay. All right, moving down on the AO, make sure this is multiplied. And just take note of all of these. If in the previous lecture you didn't do all of the steps, make sure that ship GI is normal. It must be normal. If it's additive, it's going to look very bizarre, okay? That needs to be normal. Lighting, reflection, specular, and refraction are all additive. So is the glare, that's additive. Then ship AO is going to be multiplied. And we haven't done anything with the depth yet, but we'll do that in a moment. All right, so for the refraction, this is something we talked about last time in one of the previous lectures. You could brighten up the glass if you wanted the glass to look a little bit more reflective there. You can do something like that. You have that control if you want to. So if you want to see more through the ship, as if the glass was perhaps thinner, you have the control to do that. Personally, I'm pretty happy with it, but if you wanted to add just a little bit more refraction, you could add a curve right there. If you wanted to do something like that. That's pretty subtle, but I don't know. Maybe you want to do something like that. On the specularity, grab a curves on this. And you can see we do have that control. We wouldn't want this to get too bright though, because if we made this too bright, then the ground really should be brighter. So we don't really need to do something like that in this case because it's already pretty bright. If you wanted to give it just a slight boost, you could do that. But again, our ground isn't that bright and there is going to be dust here. So on the reflection, I might actually turn on that reflection again. But in this case, I don't want it to be anywhere near as bright. I might just give that a slight boost just to give it a little bit more right there. We turn this on and off. You can see we're just adding just a little bit more brightness. And if we zoom out, I think that looks pretty good. So we still have our environment depth to do, and we still have all of the environment layers to composite, something that we'll need to do a little bit later. Because you'll notice also that the environment doesn't have denoising applied to it, because denoising does not get applied to the beauty by default. All right, so a couple other things that we can do just to get a sense of how this is going to look. You can grab another adjustment layer at the top called the CC for color correction, and your color correction must go underneath your OCIO. This has to be the first thing, it has to be on top. So just make sure that that is on top, and then we'll grab curves. And for the curves, what we could do is just some very, very slight contrast. This is already fairly contrasty. We don't want to make the shadows too dark, and we don't want to make the highlights too bright because it already looks pretty good in my opinion. But we can add just a little bit of contrast like that. And I think that will look just a little bit better. We're kind of darkening out some of the background a little bit more. We could go a little bit further and then do something with a vignette. So a vignette would be basically the edges of the camera get a little bit darker. It's more of a feature that occurs with older cameras, but you can also get the same type of thing on newer ones if you have what's called a lens hood. So poor quality lens hoods, they basically stop lens flares from affecting the shot. Because quite often you don't want lens flares, sometimes you do. In visual effects, our point is to match what the camera sees. So if there would be a lens flare in a real camera, we would want to add it. There are certain applications, creative applications, where you might want to add a lens flare. And it would be cool to add one here, but our sun is not really in view. So we could add something, but we would really need a plugin for it, which I have a really useful plugin called Optical Flares, but we don't have that on campus, and it is expensive. So we don't want to use a cheap lens flare effect. We want to do it properly. So we're not going to bother with that right now. So we could add just a little bit of that vignette, kind of pulls your eye into the shot, and this is the main point of reference. If you think the reflection as you go a little bit higher up is a little bit wrong, you could turn that layer off, not bother with it, or you could animate your curves. So as we go up and up and up, you can see if you want to include that or not. So if you think that looks a little bit bright, we could adjust that, but we're not done. We have other stuff to do, so I'll come back to this. All right, so we have that. That looks pretty good. Now we could also play around with what is called the Lumetri color. So Lumetri color is like an all-inclusive color correction effect. We'll place this above our vignette. And you can do stuff like vignettes inside Lumetri color. I personally like to itemize my effects, so I like to have them separate because I can easily turn just a singular thing off, whereas Lumetri color sometimes is a little bit tricky to do that. So if you open up basic corrections, Lumetri color though does have a really useful color temperature gauge. So if you wanted to make it look like it was much colder, you could lower this value. And this is going to pull in more blue light into the scene, and it's going to make it look a little bit cooler. Or you can do the opposite and you can push in warm light, and this is going to make everything look warmer. Like the actual temperature of the environment is going to make it look like it's hotter. Now, you wouldn't want to do something super saturated like this because it looks very, very oversaturated and fake. But you could do something pretty subtle, like you could do something like 30. And if we just toggle that on and off, we're just adding just a little bit of warmth to the shadows. It's pretty subtle, but subtlety goes a long way in a lot of color correction instances, something like this, just making it look a little warmer. Now, I mentioned in the assignment that you could swap out these for like ice cliffs or something, or snow or whatever. If you wanted to do something in a completely different biome, I do want something in the background. It has to be some type of geometry, some kind of environment. But you're not tied to using these rocks if you don't want to, okay? So if you wanted to have a slightly different temperature, or you just wanted this not to look like it's a desert and just swap out the texture for something else that you create in Photoshop for the color map, that would be fine too. And you could use something that's less sandy if you wanted to, maybe something that's more gray. But this option is something that you can use. But if you like that cool tone, that's fine too. I'm going to make this just a little bit warmer. But then I'm also going to lower the saturation. So the saturation here is pretty high, and I actually want to lower that just a little bit. Maybe something like 85. We're just pulling out 15% of that saturation. This kind of makes the scene look a little bit more homogeneous in tone. And maybe that's not what you like, but for right now, I think that looks interesting. If you wanted to play around with this, you can. Don't do something like this though. That's way too saturated. It looks very bad. It looks like something's wrong with your color. And then you wouldn't want to go the opposite direction, make the entire thing grayscale. Although there is something to be said about compositing in grayscale. It does make you more aware of value because you're not seeing any color. But in this case, I am going to include color. Maybe I'll bump that back up again. And we might tweak these settings as we go through this, because the more we look at the shot, the more we want to make some changes. And also, this would be a really good time to look at references of other ships landing. I just saw the movie Dune, and Dune has some excellent shots of ships landing in the desert and stuff. And I tried to find some from The Mandalorian, but I really would need to like screen cap those. But we're kind of running out of time to really go in a shot-by-shot comparison for this assignment. And it's more to do with just comping everything and making a reasonable looking image. Well, so I think that we can do that with these effects right here. I might actually just lower the temperature just a little bit so it's not super warm. You can also do similar things here with the curves, but also just notice that by making these adjustments, we kind of lessen the reflective quality of the sky on here as it's not as blue. But we could also go to the reflection channel. If we turn this off, you can see how much of that ship relies on this pass. And if you wanted to make this not as reflective or not as blue, it would be very easy to grab something like a hue and saturation effect. You could also do Lumetri color, and you could just desaturate this. And as you desaturate it, you lose blue, basically. So if you didn't like so much blue there, or you wanted later on, you wanted to swap out your sky for something else, but you didn't want to re-render your ship, it's a very good solution. Or like maybe it's supposed to be on a different planet and it's supposed to be reflecting something that's not 100% blue. So we could crank this up and we could get really saturated just so we can see the colors more clearly. And we could change this. This is going to look very awful if we have it saturated so much, but let's say the sky was supposed to be green. We could add a slight green tint by doing something like that. Not something I recommend for this. Let's keep the sky blue. It's going to make it more realistic. But I would like to add some clouds in here And I'll show you what to do on that if you want to re-render out the sky pass with some HDR clouds, basically. So you can combine your sunlight with clouds, no problem. So we'll do that. All right, guys, thanks for watching. In the next video, we're going to be doing depth for our defocusing or depth of field. If that's interesting, stay tuned for the next video.